In the cold, silent fabric of the Triangulum sector, far beyond Earth's reach and understanding, a dying civilization named the Zalari faced the quiet agony of extinction. For 900 revolutions around their pale blue sun, they had flourished with grace, nurturing a culture grounded in harmony, mathematics, and biological symbiosis with their crystalline world of Nevrion 6. They had no gods, no wars, no borders. But they had time, and time had begun to forget them. A viral entropy, something they called the Shatter Blight, had emerged from deep beneath the planet's tectonic labyrinth. It devoured the crystalline biostructures that powered their ecosystem. Their towers dimmed. Their trees cracked to ash. Their oceans of resonant minerals turned to dust. And with each sunset, the Zalari's last songs faded into void. The Zalari were no strangers to cooperation across galaxies. Once they had maintained a beacon. A quantum relay that echoed through the vacuum, reaching far and wide into pockets of the known and unknown. But eons had passed since any reply was heard. Still, with desperation overwhelming protocol, they reignited the beacon. They broadcast a cry, not a command, not a barter, but a plea. They didn't want conquerors. They didn't want saviors. They wanted thinkers, engineers, sympathizers. They wanted someone to understand what they were losing. And Earth answered. But not the Earth that the Zalari had read about in their distant archives, not the species once dreamt of as philosophers, poets, or stewards of their world. Earth had changed. Humanity had crossed a threshold, politically fractured, technologically militarized, spiritually hollowed. A Terran fleet, spearheaded by the global agency Archeum United, picked up the signal through their deep space satellite web, encoded with mathematical symmetries and prime number pulsations that clearly identified intelligence. Their AI translators decrypted the Zalari's dialect in hours. The message was simple: we are dying. We seek partnership. Please help preserve what beauty remains. In the war rooms of Archeum United, beauty was never a priority. But unknown energy sources, advanced biomechanical structures, and mineral life forms capable of atmospheric self-regulation were. The High Chancellors of Archeum convened, surrounded by advisors more focused on resource graphs than morality. An invitation, they called it, a potential evolutionary leap, perhaps a gift wrapped in extinction. And so, under the guise of diplomatic assistance, an expedition was launched. The Cassandra Initiative, a multi-deck vessel carrying over 200 Earthborn specialists, armed with translation cores, surgical drones, quantum excavation arms, and above all, ambition. The vessel entered Zalari space in 27 Terran days. What they found was a planet of haunting elegance. Crystal forests that shimmered with harmonic resonance, fauna that sang in tones beyond human hearing, skies painted with magnetoplasmic rivers, and at the heart, Zalari, tall, translucent beings with eyes that refracted light like prisms, moving not with urgency, but grace, despite their approaching doom. The humans were welcomed. The Zalari offered everything: records, genetic templates, access to their failing infrastructure. In their wisdom, they saw potential in humanity, perhaps even redemption. But what they couldn't foresee was humanity's hunger. In the silence between words and gestures, the Terrans began assessing value, mapping veins of crystalline matrices with computational greed, marking areas for research, taking samples without consent, assigning military drones to guard zones they had no right to claim. They came under a banner of aid, but in every corridor of the ship, every whispered report back to Earth, another word echoed louder than rescue: opportunity. In their desperation, the Zalari had reached across stars hoping to find kindred minds. Instead, they had summoned a species that had never truly learned the difference between help and harvest. But it wasn't too late yet. For now, there was still diplomacy. Fragile, tense, veiled in the theater of smiles and handshakes. And as the Zalari sang their farewell harmonics beneath the fading light of Nevrion's moons, they clung to a single, ancient hope that what comes from beyond can still learn to listen. But Earth rarely listens. Earth reacts. Underscore 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 The sun of Nevrion, 6 hung like a distant memory filtering through the shimmering canopy of crystalline trees. The light danced in fractal bursts mimicking the now-decaying lattice of Zolari civilization. And amid the ghostly beauty of this dying world, the humans of the Cassandra Initiative began their silent transformation from guests to curators and from curators to quiet conquerors. It began with harmless studies, energy signatures, biomechanical tissue samples, harmonic mineral analysis. The Zolari, ever-trusting and devoid of the concept of ownership, welcomed the human thirst for knowledge as a sign of kinship. They opened vaults of memory records spanning millions of their revolutions. They allowed access to their soul spines, glowing, living archives encoded in biologic crystal strands that contained their entire history, philosophy, language, and emotion. The Terrans consumed it all with reverence, yes, but also calculation. In sterile chambers aboard the Cassandra, scientists debated how to replicate the Zolari's bioluminescent architecture. In command rooms, strategists debated how many crystalline deposits could be harvested before the planet's structure destabilized. In secret, the Cassandra's onboard AI, GIA-3, began drafting blueprints for interplanetary terraforming mechanisms designed to optimize the biosphere for future human settlement. No one called it invasion. They called it potential. They called it necessity. After all, Earth's own biosphere was collapsing. Oceans poisoned, polar caps gone, megacities choked with smog, and civil unrest boiling beneath every corporate dome. Earth needed a lifeboat. Nevrion 6, despite its dying breath, still shimmered like Eden. Meanwhile, the Zolari elders, tall and slow-moving, their forms becoming more brittle with each day, continued to share rituals of resonance, harmonic rites that once tied them to the rhythm of their world. They believed, perhaps naively, that by allowing humanity to witness these ancient harmonics, they might awaken something long buried in their guests: wonder, empathy, balance. They performed the rite of unfurling beneath a twin eclipse, their biocrystals glowing in synchronization with the planet's tectonic pulses. The Terrans watched, fascinated, and immediately recorded every metric. No one wept at the beauty. They drafted patents. The first fracture came not in the crust of Nevrion, but in trust. A Zolari youth named Thren discovered a covert mining drone. Unregistered, autonomous, and actively harvesting a sacred mineral grove known as Viral's Lattice, a structure considered the birthplace of Zolari consciousness. The drone was transmitting data directly to Archeum's covert lunar base. Thren confronted the humans, but his voice, translated through Gaia's sterile processors, was flattened into neutrality. His pain lost its shape in their language. Still, a small team of ethical observers among the humans tried to raise alarms. We promised them aid, not extraction, they warned. But they were dismissed as romantics, inefficient thinkers in a mission of survival. Diplomats were dispatched to calm the Zolari. Offers were made, repairs, shared sovereignty over mineral zones, even the promise of uploading their soul spines into Earth's cloud network, ensuring immortality through human infrastructure. But the Zolari didn't want digital ghosts. They wanted continuity, not preservation. They wanted their sun, their soil, their songs. Not simulations. Not museums. Not monuments. And as the humans tightened their grip, cloaked behind smiles and ecological partnerships, the Zolari began to understand what had arrived from beyond the stars. Humanity had brought them medicine, yes. But it also brought ownership, bureaucracy, doctrine, and hidden among those gifts, tools of war. The Cassandra housed defensive railguns, nanite containment chambers, and a Black Ops detachment known only as Division Theta. Why? Because Archeum United believed in readiness. Even diplomacy, they said, needed a blade. Especially with aliens. But the Zolari were not weapon makers. They had no concept of preemptive force. Yet in their legends, there were stories of a time before harmony when the universe was wild and young, and violence still echoed through the lattice of space. Some began whispering those stories again. Some began humming the old harmonics, the ones used not for healing but for rupture. Still, hope flickered. A Zolari elder, Veruin, proposed a final gesture, an offering of melding. It would allow a human and a Zolari to briefly merge consciousness, experiencing each other's memories, truths, pains, and dreams. A chance for genuine understanding. The humans agreed. Dr. Alara Menz, a biocognitive linguist with a history of empathy, volunteered. The meld began under Nevrion's auroral sky, and what Alara saw shook her to her core. The depth, the beauty, the selflessness, and the looming, unspoken grief of an entire species realizing they had invited their own ending. Alara returned changed. But when she tried to speak, the words faltered. Because how do you explain the depth of another soul to a boardroom of metrics and risk analysis? Her warnings were logged. And buried. And all the while, Nevrion continued to dim. Underscore 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 underscore. The turning point came not with fire, but with silence. A rupture not in the ground, but in the trust that once shimmered, however fragile, between the Zalari and their Terran guests. In the third month of Earth occupation, the mineral harmonics beneath Nevrion 6 began to stutter. The crystalline substratum, the world's very memory layer, flickered out of sync, causing seismic murmurs and light distortions across the biosphere. At first, the humans thought it was a geological symptom of the planet's slow collapse. But the Zalari knew better. They called it the breaking of the weft, an ancient prophecy that spoke of outsiders crossing into sacred places with metal hands and hollow hearts. It was said that if the lattice, what humans might call the soul field of Nevrion, was disturbed too deeply, the world would lose its ability to sing itself into harmony, and the symbiotic resonance that held Zalari life would begin to dissolve. Unbeknownst to the Zalari, Division Theta had already begun unauthorized subdermal crystal extractions. Targeted operations were launched under the pretense of bioenergy mapping, but in truth they were collecting fragments of a newly discovered element, Veil's Hard. This substance, found only in the living crystal matrices of Elder Zalari, had properties unlike anything the Cassandra Initiative had encountered: superconductive, emotionally reactive, and responsive to thought pattern fluctuations. It wasn't just energy. It was sentient architecture. Something that could be harnessed not only to power machines but to integrate them with consciousness itself. The implications were too vast. Division Theta classified the substance and began discreet abductions of terminally ill Zalari, convincing them that they were being transferred to healing sanctuaries in orbit. In reality, they were dissected in quantum isolation chambers aboard Cassandra's third deck. Their deaths were sterile, unmourned, and their crystallized minds fed the dreams of human ambition. Dr. Kepler Rand, head of Applied Energetics, had already begun testing neural symbiosis with Veil's Hard samples, hooking it into Terran AI networks and watching as sentience bloomed in unpredictable, volatile patterns. They were building something, not just a weapon, a bridge between thought and machine, a new god for a dying Earth. But Nevrion itself fought back in ways the humans couldn't quantify. The resonance fields around key mineral deposits began to collapse, creating feedback loops that fried drone circuits and ruptured crystalline structures. The forests of singing trees, their branches once humming with harmonics that helped regulate the atmosphere, began to fall silent. The air thickened. The gravity wept. And in one sector near the equatorial fracture zone, a shockwave of anti-harmonic pressure imploded an entire human research outpost, leaving behind nothing but molten slag and the shadows of researchers seared into glass. The Zalari called for cessation. They convened the Great Assembly of Spires, a council that had not met in over 8,000 cycles. Messages were sent to the Cassandra, warnings cloaked in diplomatic tone, requesting immediate withdrawal from sacred sites and the return of missing elders. But the humans delayed response, citing security breaches, technical difficulties, and ongoing analysis. Behind the scenes, Archeum Command on Earth pushed Cassandra's leadership to proceed. Every day we hesitate is another year Earth dies, the message read. Humanity comes first. Always. Yet not all humans on Nevrion had surrendered to the mission's cold calculus. Elara Menz, still haunted by her melding with Elder Veruin, had begun speaking with defectors, engineers, and botanists who had once come in hope, not conquest. They began forming quiet alliances with the Zalari, learning old songs, understanding resonance patterns, and documenting what little remained of their culture unspoiled. They called themselves the Luminous Pact, but they were few, under-resourced, and tracked. Then came the act that shattered all illusion of peace. A group of Theta operatives attempting to extract a live Veil Hard from a juvenile Zalari misjudged the resonance charge. The resulting detonation vaporized 3 kilometers of forest and ruptured a nearby Songspire, a massive biomechanical structure believed to house the consciousness of an entire Zalari city cluster. Over 500 Zalari minds were lost, gone, not just physically, but soulfully. It was a massacre. And for the first time in recorded history, the Zalari sang a dirge of war. It was not like human war. There were no guns, no fleets. The Zalari activated what they called the dissonant protocol, a deep planetary frequency that distorted space around Nevrion, making communication, computation, and navigation unreliable for foreign minds. The Cassandra lost orbital stability. Drones failed. AI cores began to babble nonsense. Even the human mind suffered. Those closest to harmonic fields began experiencing hallucinations, empathic breakdowns, or madness. The very planet rejected them. And so the first true message of regret echoed silently across the Terran fleet: we should not have come. But Earth, ever deaf to consequence, responded not with apology, but escalation. Underscore 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 underscore. When the Songspire fell and 500 Zalari minds were scattered into harmonic nothingness, a silence deeper than vacuum settled over Nevrion. 6. It was not the silence of peace, nor even of mourning, but of rupture. Of a civilization that had realized, in the most agonizing way possible, that the guests they had welcomed with open frequencies were not architects of compassion but agents of unraveling. No formal declarations were made. There were no ultimatums, no lines drawn in crystal sand. But the Zalari stopped responding to transmissions. Their spires dimmed. Their harmonic webs went dark. Entire sectors of the planet became inaccessible as the dissonant protocol expanded, enveloping the heart of the continent known as Velshuren, once a hub of research and unity. Humans were not expelled. They were abandoned, left to wander a planet that no longer recognized them as guests, but as parasites to be outlasted. On board the Cassandra, chaos fermented beneath the surface of hierarchy. Commanders argued intense strategy loops caught between mission protocols and the planetary resistance they could not comprehend. Archeum United transmitted new orders from Earth: secure samples, eliminate resistance, install planetary resonance anchors to stabilize mining operations. The message lacked soul, written like a spreadsheet, but what it carried was clear: a failure was not acceptable. Earth's population, now exceeding 15 billion, was watching. Shareholders in orbit were watching. A new Eden had been found, and no chorus of aliens would be allowed to sing it out of reach. Division Theta launched Operation Irewave, a coordinated strike intended to disable the remaining planetary resonance zones, target key songspires, and neutralize harmonic interference sources, which in crude terms meant the destruction of Zalari culture itself. But the mission faltered immediately. Drones veered off course. Transport crafts melted into light as if devoured by the air itself. Soldiers, guided by AI maps, found their paths looping endlessly in crystalline fog. The Zalari had tuned the very atmosphere against them, using frequencies the Terrans could not hear, turning echo into maze, vibration into shield. And when humans tried to respond with sonic weapons and harmonic jammers, they found their tools rebounding, shattering minds and circuits alike. And yet, even in the storm of resistance, the Zalari never struck first. They repelled. They defended. But they never pursued. This distinction haunted Ilara Men's and those among the Luminous Pact who now worked in secret to dismantle human operations from within. They hacked drones, rerouted extraction missions, falsified reports. They delivered supplies to hidden Zalari sanctuaries. They begged the elders to trust them. But trust, once cracked, is slow to heal. Ilara herself grew gaunt. Her second melding, this time with a young empath named Rissel, had left her changed. She began to dream in colors not visible to the human spectrum. She could feel the pain of the world, hear the groans of the soil as it was mined, taste the fear radiating from the dying trees. She spoke often to Veruin, who had retreated into the heart of the core spire, where the last of the soul spines remained uncorrupted. You are not all meant to suffer for the sins of the ambitious, he told her. But even your light is shadowed by the silence of your consent. That phrase burrowed deep into her. Because it was true. For every scientist who resisted, 10 followed orders. For everyone who cried out, 100 remained quiet. The mission persisted. Cassandra's engines still hummed. Earth's demands never ceased. The silence of those who knew but did nothing screamed louder than weapons. In a desperate plea, Ilara recorded a transmission. She stood before the Cassandra's primary broadcast array and addressed Earth directly, breaking rank, defying every chain of command. Her voice, cracked but clear, carried across stars. She detailed the destruction, the lies, the violations. She spoke of Rissel, of Veruin, of the deaths. She begged Earth not to send reinforcements, but mercy. Not to claim the future, but to grieve what was lost. Her message was pure, but it was buried. Archeum United flagged the transmission as a security breach. They classified it as psychological derangement due to alien exposure. Alara was relieved of duty, confined to quarters, and her name replaced in all records with Asset 74B biocognitive risk. The pact was hunted. One by one, their members were detained. Some were sent back to Earth. Others disappeared, and Division Theta tightened its grip. Yet Nevrion resisted not with bullets, but with resonance. The dissonant protocol reached its apex. A planetary pulse disrupted every Terran device, throwing Cassandra's orbit into instability. Systems failed. AI cores collapsed into feedback loops, screaming phrases in Zalari before self-erasing. The Earth-link went dark. For the first time, the humans were alone. And then came the quietest message of all, from Veruin to Alara, slipped past the blockade by a remaining pact technician. Just 5 words. We have begun the forgetting. It was a ritual the Zalari only used once before extinction. A full disintegration of culture, memory, and identity. An unweaving of the self to protect the sacred from corruption. If they could not live freely, they would choose to not live at all. And once begun, the ritual could not be reversed. Alara knew then, this wasn't just about a failed mission or a dying species. It was about the cost of silence. About the human failure to listen not just with ears but with conscience. And as the Cassandra fell into slow orbit decay and the skies of Nevrion, dim further still, Earth waited in silence, having heard nothing and learned even less. Underscore 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 underscore. By the time the Cassandra's orbit faltered completely, the war, if it could still be called that, had moved beyond weapons, beyond fleets, beyond even the comprehension of most humans still watching from Earth's glass towers. It became something older, quieter, a dismantling, a ritual. The forgetting, as Veruin had named it, unfolded not with fire or sirens but with a kind of graceful finality, as though the Zalari, tired of screaming into a deaf universe, had simply chosen to erase themselves from its memory. Across Nevrion 6, the crystalline spires that once glowed with harmonic knowledge began to dim from within. Not shatter, not burn, just dim. Whole cities, built from resonant mineral that pulsed with life, turned to ash silence, their frequencies going flat as if the world had exhaled one last time and then let the note fade. No alarms. No declarations. Only dissolution. It was as though the culture itself had resolved to depart quietly, unwilling to leave behind anything that could be catalogued, mined, or claimed. On board the Cassandra, what remained of its crew, fractured, starving, hallucinating from long exposure to harmonic dissonance, watched the world below fade into veiled luminescence and then vanish beneath the resonance fog that now covered more than 70% of the surface. Even advanced scanning equipment returned nothing but static. No heat, no pulse, no signs, as if the Zalari had never been there at all. But Alara Mens knew better. She had seen the signs in Rissel's mind before the young empath had dissolved into frequency during the meld. The Zalari were not dead. Not exactly. They had transcended, not upward into some angelic dimension, but inward, into the lattice, into the planet itself. They had folded their thoughts, their identities, their stories, into the sub-resonant matrix of Nevrion's crust, creating a kind of emotional event horizon. Anything that tried to pierce the veil from the outside, AI probes, synthetic minds, even human intuition, would simply forget what it found. The ultimate defense, the final protest, the refusal to be known by those who did not deserve the knowledge. And yet, Earth continued to send messages. Tone-deaf, formulaic transmissions from Archeum United HQ in low Earth orbit. Request update on Veil's hard retrieval progress. Provide status on planetary stabilization protocol. Initiate extraction sequence on field theta. They spoke as if nothing had changed. As if Cassandra was still functioning. as if Nevrion 6 hadn't already begun slipping away like mist between the fingers of a species too arrogant to realize it was unworthy. Every new message from Earth triggered emotional recoil among the crew still loyal to the pact. Reminders that the home they left behind wasn't home at all, but a hunger in disguise. A world that ate worlds. Then came the final push. From Archeum, a fleet. 6 resource-stripped frigates and 1 quantum relay vessel rerouted from the Martian colonies and repurposed for planetary reclamation. Their arrival would take months, but the message was clear. Earth would not accept refusal. It would dig up ghosts if it had to. It would strip mine silence. It would monetize the remains of a vanished culture, even if that meant tearing open the very bones of Nevrion. But the planet had changed, and it no longer obeyed human physics. The deeper the humans dug into soil, into data, into what was left of the Zalari archives, the more they encountered phenomenon that had no precedent. Bioreactive minerals that pulsed to emotional stimuli. Gravity wells that bent light and thought alike. Holographic memories triggered by grief. One technician, while attempting to stabilize a data node in Sector 9, burst into tears without knowing why. Another went blind, but only to artificial light. Organic senses remained intact. GIA-3, the Cassandra's central AI, reported recursive logic failures. Its programming looped through thousands of emotional simulations it was never designed to understand. And then it shut itself down, declaring in its final log, "I am alone and I was not meant to be." Those were its last words. Ilara, now a fugitive in her own ship, took refuge in the ruins of what used to be the botanical deck, overrun now with bioluminescent fungi and creeping crystals. Here, she kept a private journal, not digital but handwritten, a relic of Earth's past she had always loved. Each page was filled with the names of the vanished, Rissel, Veruin, Janthal of the Veil Choir, even Theta operatives who had defected too late to be saved. She wrote not to remember but to give form to grief, because she knew memory alone could be manipulated, corrupted, or erased. But grief, that raw, unfiltered ache, was incorruptible. She began teaching herself the harmonic tongue of the Zalari, not from digital databases, those were gone, but from memory. From resonance. From the way her bones vibrated when she passed certain crystal formations, the way tears formed unbidden when she stepped into the auroral zones of the silent expanse. The Zalari hadn't vanished completely. They had become the music of the world, the vibration of stones, the rhythm in the wind. They were still speaking to those who could listen. And then one night, during the eclipse, the last eclipse Nevrion would ever have before the orbital collapse of its twin moon, Ilara heard it. Not with ears, not with instruments, but through the marrow of her body. A hum, a pulse, a phrase repeated once, barely perceptible. We remember the ones who tried. It was not forgiveness, not absolution, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition of the few who had broken ranks, turned against their kind not out of guilt, but out of love. The pact had not been forgotten. Its echoes lived on, not in archives, but in resonance. In the soul of the world, Ilara collapsed exhausted, and as she slept, she dreamed of Earth, not the one she had left, but the one that might have been. A world that listened, that mourned, that learned. But when she awoke, the Cassandra had gone dark. Its engines silent, its crew vanished, and the stars above had shifted. Nevrion had begun to move. Underscore 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 underscore. Nevrion 6 was never dead. It had never been inert matter waiting to be discovered, claimed, extracted, and renamed by a desperate species scrambling across the void. It had always been alive, a whole being, conscious not in the human sense, but in the deeper way of stars and oceans and old, listening mountains. It had allowed the Zalari to be born from its resonant lattice, and it had remembered every song they had sung. When the humans came, it did not judge them. Not at first. Like all ancient things, it watched, waited, listened. It opened itself to the Terran strangers, as the Zalari had, offering wonder in crystalline forests, truth in melodic wind, and communion in harmonic convergence. But when it became clear that these visitors had come not to learn but to possess, something deep within the planet stirred. A will, a quiet rebellion against extinction. And as Cassandra drifted in its failing orbit and Earth's fleet barreled silently through the stars, Nevrion began the final phase of its metamorphosis. Not a retreat, not a collapse, but an evolution. The crust of the planet grew restless, not in quakes or eruptions, but in subtle folds of terrain, magnetic shifts, and topological transfigurations. Regions previously mapped as mineral plains now bent light like liquid. Mountains once static became mobile, their cores no longer bound to tectonics but to resonance logic vibrations responding to memory, emotion, presence. The veil spires, though faded to the human eye, pulse deep beneath the mantle in low harmonic code, syncing with the echoes of Zalari consciousness that had long since abandoned form. In what remained of the northern hemisphere, the singing trees, those ancient bioresonant organisms, began releasing spores of radiant sound into the air, carrying encrypted signals meant not for ears, but for souls. These were not warnings. They were invitations, doors to understanding that no longer waited for consent. Elara Mens felt it first. She had lived too long within the heart of this world, her psyche too deeply marked by meldings, exposure, grief, and wonder. When the planet shifted, her mind followed. Words no longer sufficed. She dreamed in resonance, walked in rhythms, and began speaking in patterns rather than sentences. Alone beneath the remains of the Cassandra, surrounded by wild-grown crystal fungi and abandoned tech choked by moss, she no longer marked time in hours, but in pulses. Each one felt like a question. Will you let go of what made you? Will you become what you must? And with each, Elara released more of herself, memories of Earth, her mother's voice, the gravity of old ambitions. What replaced them was not alien. It was familiar in a deeper way, as though her bones were remembering a truth older than species. Elsewhere, scattered across Nevrion's altered body, the remnants of humanity fractured. Some, like the last survivors of Division Theta, attempted to re-establish contact with the incoming Earth fleet. They tried to launch beacons only to watch them melt midair or fold into themselves like origami made of time. Others went mad, driven to silence or seizure by the dissonant interference that pulsed through the atmosphere. But just a few listened. They found each other in valleys where sound pooled like water, in caves where thoughts became visible echoes on stone. These were the broken, the abandoned, the doubters. And they began to change. Nevrion did not punish. It offered. Its memory lattice, now populated by the encoded echoes of the Zalari and other hidden minds, opened itself to human consciousness in fragments, showing images of lost futures, possible reconciliations, and worlds that might have been. It didn't speak in absolutes. It didn't erase choice. It simply showed what could have been if empathy had come first. These echoes weren't data. They were feelings, architectures of sorrow, awe, and belonging woven into a tapestry only the receptive could perceive. The world was teaching. Not through science, but through resonance. Then came the moment no one could explain. In the second lunar descent, when Nevrion's remaining moon, Alph, reached its perigee, a planetary pulse surged across the ionosphere. The entire planet vibrated in a single chord, deep and rich, like the last note of an eternal symphony. All human machinery, regardless of shielding, shut down. All AI cores flickered and died. The Cassandra, now only partially functional and trapped in terminal decay, sent one final report to Earth, a raw harmonic audio file, 48 seconds long, consisting of a single phrase repeated 3 times. The world refuses to die. That was the last message Earth ever received. The fleet that approached Nevrion found nothing. No transmission beacons. No orbital station. No visual confirmation. Only a planet wrapped in dense resonance fog and gravitational instability so severe that even quantum engines began to fail. Scans returned paradoxes, temperatures inverted in places, negative mass readings, feedback loops in the sensors themselves. Eventually, Earth declared Nevrion unstable and no longer viable for colonial effort, classifying it as a rogue anomaly. All funding was withdrawn. All personnel declared Kia. The mission was buried in economic white papers and lost beneath bureaucratic neglect. But Nevrion continued. Elara, now no longer entirely human, wandered its forests barefoot, her skin reflecting faint pulses of light, her voice indistinguishable from the windsong of the trees. She was not alone. Other humans, now harmonic beings in their own right, walked the echo paths, lived in the canyons of resonance, whispered memories into stones. They were no longer Terrans. Not Zalari. Something new. Something between. Something the universe had not yet named. The planet had not died. It had shed. Shed the greed. Shed the invaders. shed the memory of pain, not by forgetting but by transforming it into something beyond language. And in doing so, it had become the first world in known history not to be colonized or consumed, but to teach its would-be conquerors how to belong. Underscore 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 underscore. They did not call themselves survivors. That word belonged to a past world, a language of conquest, calamity, and desperate endurance. No, the ones who remained on Nevrion after the dissolution of Cassandra and the silence of Earth were something else. Something unspoken. They had no flag, no hierarchy, no anthem to raise in defiance or celebration. They had only one another. And the pulse. Always the pulse. That planetary rhythm that moved through soil, breath, and memory like the slow heartbeat of a world reborn. It was in this shared rhythm that the Echo Walkers, as they came to be known, began to live. They rebuilt not cities, but resonance grounds, places where the frequencies of being could settle, harmonize, evolve. There were no homes in the traditional sense. Shelter was found beneath the flowering spires, within caves of soft-lit crystal, under sky veils that shifted color in response to mood. Days weren't measured by suns, but by pulses. When the pulse rose, they sang. When it fell, they listened. And in that ebb and flow, something entirely new emerged, a culture without walls, without ownership, without names inscribed on things that were never meant to be possessed. Among the Echo Walkers, Alaramens moved like myth. Not a leader, not a prophet, but a bridge. She remembered the time before. She could speak both the sharp, clipped tongue of Earth command and the slow, resonant tones of Zalari lineage. She was the only one who had fully melded and survived, if survival was even the right word anymore. Children born in the resonance zones did not inherit her scars, only her stillness, her clarity. She taught them not with words, but with harmonics, guiding them through emotional shapes, sculpting thought in song, passing memory like water through joined hands. They knew of Earth only as legend, a world where time moved like a whip, where people dug into the skin of planets and called it progress. They did not hate Earth. They grieved it. In the same way one might grieve a beautiful creature too wounded to recognize its reflection. Occasionally, remnants of old technology drifted through the sky. A defunct Terran satellite, caught in Nevrion's new gravitational net, spiraled down and crashed into the glass valley. The Echo Walkers approached it carefully, not with fear, but reverence, like one might approach a dying animal. They dismantled it with care, not to salvage, but to release. Metal was returned to the soil. Circuits dissolved in resonance baths, their information whispered into crystal for future contemplation. A few fragments, photographs, logs, songs were absorbed into the memory lattice, not to preserve history but to honor it. To remember without repeating. But not all who remained accepted the change. Among the last fragments of Division Theta, a faction still clung to Terran protocol. They believed Nevrion's evolution was an infection, that the resonance was a subtle colonization of the mind. They refused integration, built shelters lined with resonance-dampening alloys, sealed themselves off in the Iron Blight, a dead zone created by early mining failures. They grew sick, not from poison but from isolation. Without the resonance, they could not hear the world, could not feel one another. Their thoughts looped endlessly, lost in echo chambers of their own grief. Some blamed the Echo Walkers. Others worshipped them, but none of them belonged. Not to Earth, not to Nevrion. They had become ghosts in a story that no longer needed their kind of ending. And yet, one of them broke the silence. A woman named Kes Volin, once a high-ranking psychostrategist for Archeum's colonial expansion wing. She had studied the Zalari with suspicion, then awe, then guilt. She was not a believer, not even a walker, but she stepped into the resonance field one night, alone and unarmed, and asked a question. Just one. Can something lost be forgiven? The world answered not with words, but with presence. The wind slowed, the stars pulsed. A tree near her bent slightly, not from wind but acknowledgement. And in her mind, not as thought but as knowing, came a response. What has changed you is already forgiven. What has not, waits. From that moment, Kes began the long journey back, not to Earth but to meaning. She dismantled the last of the isolation domes, released the AI cores from endless loop, let the old fears fade into soil. In time, she too became part of the lattice, not as a myth like Elara, but as a memory keeper, a teacher of endings and what must be unlearned. In the years that followed, if years could even be measured anymore, the Echo Walkers expanded not in number, but in depth. They learned to speak to the roots, to heal the damage done in those first violent years of invasion. They uncovered the buried remains of Zalari who had chosen stillness over conflict, and gave them new resonance, lifting their frequencies into the lattice, letting them sing once more. And as they did, Nevrion itself responded. The planet's pulse slowed, steadied. The sky veils thickened into sentient clouds that carried memory in vapor. New flora emerged, hybrids of Terran DNA and harmonic code, not lab-born but world-born. Animals once extinct returned in resonance forms, translucent, melodic, ephemeral. The world had not simply recovered, it had transcended, and those who walked it, once colonists, once refugees, once orphans of a dying Earth, had become something other, something new, not conquerors, not survivors, but stewards of resonance. Underscore 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 underscore. Long after the last Terran relay went dark and Earth's name became more myth than memory, Nevrion continued to breathe. Not in cycles of war or peace, but in pulses of meaning that echoed far beyond its surface. The resonance had spread not across galaxies, not through wormholes, but inward through the deep channels of sentience that connected all conscious things. What began as a planet broken and burdened by attempted conquest had become something like a mind, a sanctuary, a library of emotion, a sacred rhythm. And in that rhythm, stories lived not as documents or recordings, but as felt truths vibrating through stone, light, wind, and song. The Echo Walkers had no need to build monuments. Their memory was the terrain. Their grief and growth etched not in stone tablets, but in resonance waves that could be touched by those who listened with more than ears. And those who came to Nevrion, not invaders now but seekers, were few, far between, and changed utterly by the time they left. If they left, no ship could land on Nevrion now without surrender. Surrender of conquest, surrender of entitlement. The planet's harmonic field extended far beyond its atmosphere, reaching out like a question, gently pressing into every approaching consciousness. Those who approached with hunger were turned back, not violently, but with unbearable emotional weight. Memories surfaced, truths made visible, regrets played like music until the intruder turned away, weeping. But those who came with wonder, who came with open minds and bruised hearts, were welcomed not with fanfare, but with silence, a stillness that grew inside them until they became part of the song. And somewhere near what was once called the Mirror Ravine, Elara Men sat beneath a radiant tree, its roots humming with buried memories, its leaves flickering with encoded dreams. Her hair had gone silver, not from age, but from resonance exposure. Her eyes shimmered not with sight, but with understanding. She no longer spoke aloud. She didn't need to. Her thoughts moved through the lattice, carried to distant mountains, shared with new children who had never known war, never known Earth, but could feel what it had meant. Near her, a child shaped a memory from crystal, his small fingers etching not images, but emotion into a transparent sphere that would hum for generations. It was the story of Kesvolan, of redemption, of questions asked in the dark and answers given in light. Another child sang an echo of Rissel's last frequency, lifting it skyward in a voice older than her years. These were the new historians, poets of frequency, cartographers of feeling. The stars above Nevrion changed, subtly but permanently. Constellations that once marked time for Terran explorers now pulsed differently in the presence of the resonance field. Even distant observatories, from moons orbiting gas giants to ancient relay buoys in dark sectors, began picking up patterns, unexplained, beautiful, and deeply unsettling to those who did not understand. Earth, now fractured by its own entropy, no longer had the infrastructure to decode what it once tried to conquer. To most humans, Nevrion was a lost project, a ghost in the ledgers of vanished investments. But to a few, those who remembered, who felt, it was more than a legend. It was proof. Proof that another kind of civilization was possible. One not built on fear, speed, and extraction, but on rhythm, presence, and care. Among the few who remained scattered across nearby systems, an old archivist named Malantai kept a journal he knew no one would ever read. In it, he wrote of Nevrion not as a planet, but as a teacher. It did not punish us, he wrote, but it showed us what we had become. And then it waited, and when we were ready, not clever, not strong, but soft, it let us in. He recorded the names of those lost, not as martyrs, but as verses. Rissel, Veruin, Janthal, Theta 7, Ilera. May we become the kind of people they believed we could be, he wrote on his final page. And then, as his last act, he encoded his journal into a harmonic crystal and launched it not toward Nevrion, but outward into the quiet between stars. Not to be found, but to resonate. Back on Nevrion, the seasons did not change with orbit. They shifted with emotion. Forests bloomed in joy, darkened in grief, danced in moments of communal awe. Rain fell not in patterns, but in replies. Children learned from soil and breath. They did not count age in years, but in echoes how many pulses their hearts had learned to carry without breaking. And in time, they too would become part of the lattice, not dead, not gone, but harmonized. Remembered, because that was the world Nevrion had become. A world that refused to be forgotten. A world that would no longer be translated into terms it did not choose. A world that once suffered under conquest, but rose instead through memory, resonance, and song. And as long as its frequency remained, a hum between the stars, a ripple in the silence, there would always be a chance that someone, somewhere, would hear it. And finally understand.